The iron shackles hit the marshal's desk with a sound like a death knell. "You want me to believe," Marshal Garrett Holt said slowly, leaning back in his chair and studying the man standing before him with something between disbelief and cold calculation, "that Bo Irons is turning himself in." Bo stood in the doorway of the Redemption Creek jailhouse, his broad shoulders filling the frame, his dark eyes steady despite everything. He was a man who looked like the land itself had carved him. Rough-hewn jaw shadowed with several days of beard, a scar cutting clean through his left brow, hands that had held a gun more times than he could count and never once trembled. He was wanted in 4 territories. His name alone made stagecoach drivers check their horses and lawmen reach for their rifles, and he had just laid his own irons on the desk. "That's exactly what I want you to believe," Bo said, his voice like gravel under boot leather, "because it's true." Holt stood slowly. "You ride into my town, drop your shackles, and expect me not to wonder what the trap is." "No trap." Bo's jaw tightened. "I came to make a deal. Men like you don't make deals. Men like you run. Not anymore." Holt circled him slowly, the way a man circles a rattlesnake he cannot quite convince himself is dead. "The Irons gang robbed the Silver Creek Railway twice in 18 months. You shot 2 of my deputies, Bo, 2 good men. I never shot anyone who wasn't shooting first." The words came out flat, not defensive, just facts. "But I'm not here to argue my ledger. I'm here because there's a woman in your town who needs protection I can't give her while I'm outside the law, and the only currency I've got left is myself." The marshal went very still. And in the terrible silence of that jailhouse, everything Bo Irons had spent the last 3 weeks sacrificing crashed against everything he had spent the last 8 years running from. Her name was Fiona Keller. And she had no idea he had just traded every last inch of his freedom for her safety. 3 weeks earlier, the town of Redemption Creek had been exactly what its name implied for exactly nobody. It was a dust-choked settlement in the New Mexico territory, pressed between Red Canyon walls and baking under a September sun that felt personal in its cruelty. The year was 1882, and the frontier was shifting. The railroad had reached deep into the territory, bringing with it merchants and lawyers and land speculators who smelled money in the red earth and did not care much who had been living on it before they arrived. Fiona Keller had arrived in Redemption Creek 6 months before Bo did, riding the stage from Santa Fe with 2 traveling trunks, a leather satchel full of surveying documents, and the kind of posture that dared anyone to tell her she did not belong. She was 26, which in 1882 meant the world had been telling her for 3 years that she had missed her best chance at a decent life by failing to marry while she still had the bloom of youth working in her favor. Fiona had considered that opinion carefully and dismissed it with a thoroughness that had become something of a personal habit. She had come to Redemption Creek because her father, James Keller, had left her a small parcel of land in his will when he died the previous spring. It was not much, 30 acres along the eastern canyon ridge, a modest cabin that had seen better decades, and a creek that ran fast in the spring and thin in late summer. But it was hers, and that mattered in a way that was difficult to put into language but very easy to feel in the chest. The problem was a man named Clarence Voss. Voss was the kind of man who wore fine clothes in an unfine place and believed that made him better than everyone around him. He had come to Redemption Creek 2 years prior as a land agent working on behalf of the Consolidated Western Land Company, a corporation based in St. Louis that was quietly swallowing up parcels all across the New Mexico territory in anticipation of a proposed railroad extension. Voss had a lawyer, a hired enforcer named Dix who wore his gun low and his hat lower, and a talent for finding legal ambiguities that, when examined closely, turned out to be less ambiguous than invented. He wanted Fiona's land. The cabin sat on the only viable water access along a 2-mile stretch of the canyon ridge. Without it, the railroad spur could not easily be routed north, which meant Voss's contract with the Consolidated Western Land Company was worth considerably less than he had promised his employers. He had offered Fiona a price. She had declined. He had offered again at a lower price because rejection apparently translated in his mind as an opening for negotiation. She had declined again, more firmly. Then the legal documents had started appearing. A disputed title claim filed with the territorial court in Santa Fe. A survey discrepancy that called into question whether her father's original homestead claim had been properly registered. A creditor's lien against the property that referenced a debt her father had allegedly owed to a company Fiona had never heard of and could find no record of in any of her father's correspondence. Each document was just plausible enough to require a response, and each response cost money. Money for the territorial attorney she had hired in Santa Fe, money for the messenger riders carrying documents back and forth, money for the surveys she had commissioned to counter the survey discrepancies Voss's lawyers kept manufacturing. Fiona was not poor, but she was not wealthy, and Voss seemed to understand that the real battle was not legal. It was financial. He was bleeding her dry one filing at a time and doing it with a smile. When Bo Irons rode into Redemption Creek on a bruised-looking gray horse with his collar turned up against the dust, he was not looking for a cause to champion. He was looking for a place to rest that was not a cave and a meal that was not jerky. He had been riding hard for 11 days, putting distance between himself and a very angry situation in the Arizona Territory that had involved a misunderstanding about a gold shipment. A Wells Fargo man with a longer memory than expected, and the sudden dissolution of the Irons gang, which had turned out to be less of a gang and more of a loosely affiliated group of men who scattered the moment things became inconvenient. He took a room at the only boarding house in Redemption Creek, paid 3 days in advance under the name Carter, and slept for 14 hours straight. He met Fiona the next morning at the general store. She was arguing with the proprietor, a nervous man named Hadley, who was explaining in apologetic tones that he could no longer extend her credit on supplies. Voss, it emerged, had spoken to Hadley about the outstanding debts attached to her property, and suggested, with the particular brand of casual menace that men like Voss had perfected, that extending credit to someone in such uncertain legal standing might reflect poorly on Hadley's own business relationships with the land company. Fiona was not raising her voice. That was the first thing Bo noticed. She was not crying or pleading or doing any of the things that women in bad situations were sometimes expected to do to earn sympathy. She was standing very straight, her hands flat on the counter, her dark auburn hair pinned up under a sun-worn hat, and she was explaining to Hadley, in a voice that was almost frighteningly controlled, exactly what she thought of a man who let himself be used as a tool of intimidation against a neighbor. Hadley went red and said he was sorry and that he had no choice. Fiona said that everyone always had a choice, and that someday Hadley would have to explain his to someone whose opinion mattered to him, and she hoped that would be instructive. Then she picked up the items she had already paid for, a small sack of flour and a tin of coffee, and walked toward the door. She stopped when she nearly walked directly into Bo, who had been standing in the doorway for the last 30 seconds listening with an expression that was more complicated than his face usually allowed. She looked up at him. He was considerably taller than her, broader, and he looked like a man who had spent significant time outdoors and insufficient time indoors. She did not apologize for nearly running into him. She simply waited for him to move. He stepped aside. She walked out. He stood there for a moment, then bought a box of ammunition and a tin of peaches, and thought about how some women had a spine that made everyone around them look like they were made of wet paper. He did not go looking for her after that. He told himself he was in Redemption Creek for rest, not complications. He told himself he was in no position to get involved in anyone else's trouble when his own trouble had a price tag of $800 and was growing. He told himself a lot of things in the 2 days that followed, the way a man does when he already knows what he is going to do, but needs to work up to the decision honestly. On his 3rd morning in town, he saw her again. She was walking down the main street with a rolled-up survey map tucked under one arm and a letter in her hand, and a man fell into step beside her. The man was Dix, Voss's enforcer. He was not touching her. He did not need to. He was just close enough, speaking low enough, that the threat was in the geometry itself. Fiona kept walking. Her chin was up, but her pace had quickened almost imperceptibly, and Beau had spent enough time watching people in dangerous situations to read the difference between genuine confidence and performed confidence. She was frightened. She was just better at hiding it than most. Dix said something that made her stop, and for one moment, something flickered across her face that was not control. It was something raw and tired and close to breaking, and it was gone almost instantly. But Beau had seen it. He crossed the street. "That's a fine morning to you," he said, inserting himself into the space between them with the easy assurance of a man who had walked into far more dangerous situations for considerably less reason. He nodded to Fiona first, then looked at Dix with the particular flat quality of expression that men recognized as a warning. "Friend of yours?" Dix studied him. Dix was the kind of man who was good at reading other men because his employment depended on it. He looked at Beau's hands, his stance, the way he held himself, and came to a conclusion that made him take one deliberate half-step back. "Just having a conversation," Dix said. "That right?" It was not a question, a pause. Dix glanced at Fiona, then back at Beau, and the calculation behind his eyes was transparent. He smiled, the smile of a man who is postponing something rather than abandoning it, and walked away. Fiona turned to look at Beau with an expression that contained both gratitude and suspicion in roughly equal measure. "I didn't need that," she said. "I know," he said. "I wasn't doing it because you needed it. I was doing it because I didn't like how he was standing." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "You're new in town. Few days. Are you going to tell me your name, or should I just call you the man from the doorway of Hadley's?" He almost smiled. It was the almost that she noticed. "Beau," he said, and did not offer the last name, which she understood immediately as deliberate and chose not to push. "Fiona Keller," she said, and extended her hand like a business partner, not a woman waiting to be charmed. He shook it. Her grip was firm and her palm was calloused from work, which told him more about her than 5 minutes of conversation would have. "The man who walked away," he said, nodding in the direction Dix had gone. "He's been doing that often." Her jaw tightened fractionally. "Often enough." "Want to tell me about it?" "Why would I tell you? I don't know you." "Because," Beau said, with the kind of directness that was either refreshing or offensive depending on the listener, "sometimes telling a stranger the shape of a problem helps you see the edges of it more clearly. And strangers can't hold it against you later." She looked at him for a long moment. The September light was hot and direct and very honest, and in it she could see that he was not pretty in any conventional sense. He was too roughly made for that, too clearly marked by a life that had not been gentle. But there was something in his eyes that was not cruel. Not kind exactly, but not cruel. "I have a property dispute," she said carefully. "A man named Voss wants my land. He's been filing false claims against the title, cutting off my credit lines, and sending that man to remind me periodically that my situation is not comfortable. Why hasn't the marshal done anything? Marshal Holt is not corrupt. He's just limited. Without an act of direct physical violence, his hands are tied. The law and Voss are playing in different arenas." Her voice was matter-of-fact, but the tiredness underneath it was palpable. Bo was quiet for a moment. He looked down the street toward the building where Voss's land office was, a freshly painted establishment with a sign that read Consolidated Western Land Company, New Mexico Territory Office. "How long do you think you can hold on?" he asked. It was a blunt question. Most men would not have asked it. Most men would have offered reassurances. The bluntness of it seemed to startle her slightly and then seemed to earn something. "My attorney in Santa Fe thinks if I can keep the title claim disputed for another 4 to 6 months, Voss's company may redirect the railroad survey and cut their losses. The financial pressure is the problem. I'm running out of room. What happens if Voss wins the title dispute?" Her chin came up. "He won't. But if he does, a beat. I lose the property, I lose the cabin, I have enough money left to get myself to Santa Fe and not much beyond that." She said it flatly, with the steady voice of someone who had already stared that possibility in the face at 3 in the morning and was not going to pretend otherwise. "But he won't win. I intend to make sure of it." Bo looked at her. Something settled in his chest that felt uncomfortably like a decision being made before his mind had caught up to it. "I'll be around," he said. "For a few days more at least." She raised an eyebrow. "Is that meant to comfort me?" "It's meant to be a fact," he said. "What you do with it is your business." She held his gaze for one moment, and something shifted in her expression. Not softening exactly, more like a door opening 1 inch to let in light without fully committing to welcome. Then she nodded once, tucked her survey map more firmly under her arm, and continued down the street. Bo watched her go, and the decision that had been forming in the back of his mind set itself like concrete. He stayed. The days that followed were careful and quiet in the particular way that things are before a storm. Bo kept his distance in public. He was aware of the precariousness of his own situation, aware that drawing too much attention was not survivable for a man with his history, but he found reasons to be nearby. He took his meals at the same hour as Fiona when she came into town. He positioned himself, subtly and without theater, in places where his presence served as a passive deterrent to Dix's more brazen intrusions, and he listened. He was very good at listening. It was a skill that had kept him alive in situations where other men's louder approaches had gotten them killed. He listened to the conversations at the saloon, to the opinions of the men who played cards in the evenings, to the subtle architecture of resentment and fear that Voss had built in the town around him. He learned that 2 other property owners had already sold to the land company under pressure. He learned that Dix had broken a man's wrist in a back alley the previous spring, and that the man had declined to report it. He learned that Voss received telegrams from St. Louis with increasing regularity, and that they seemed to be applying their own pressure from the eastern end. On the 5th day, Fiona invited him to the property. She said it was because she needed help repairing a section of fence that was beyond one person's ability to manage, and she had no money to pay a hand. She said it with complete practicality, and without any of the social prelude that such an invitation might otherwise involve. He said yes with equivalent practicality, and they rode out to the eastern canyon ridge together in the early morning, saying very little. The land was beautiful in the way that hard-working land is beautiful. Not decorative, not designed to impress, but alive with a kind of purpose. The creek ran quick and clear along the lower edge of the property. Cottonwood trees standing in a ragged line along its bank, their leaves just beginning to show the first yellow of autumn. The cabin was small and solid, and clearly the work of someone who had built for permanence rather than appearance. Her father's work, Bo understood without being told. They worked through the morning on the fence, which was a real job. Several posts had come loose in the summer heat, and the wire needed resetting with proper tension. Fiona worked beside him without performing helplessness, handing tools when they were needed, holding posts while he drove them, making decisions about wire placement that were correct. He noticed she wore her father's work gloves, which were too large for her hands. She had stuffed the fingers with cloth to make them fit. During a rest in the middle of the day, sitting in the thin shade of a cottonwood with the creek sound filling the silence, she asked him, without preamble, without apology for the directness, "What are you running from?" He looked at her. "You know men who run," she said, not as an accusation. "You have the look of one. You're good with your hands in a way that comes from more than ranch work. You paid 3 days in advance at Simmons' boarding house under a name that isn't yours." He was quiet for a moment. She waited, which was its own kind of pressure, not aggressive, just patient. "My past," he said finally, "the kind that has a price on it." "How much?" he told her. She absorbed that with a stillness that was impressive. Then, "What did you do?" "Robbed a railway company twice. Robbed a couple of stage coaches carrying payroll. Never killed anyone who wasn't trying to kill me first." She was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the creek. "Do you regret it?" It was the question he had never expected anyone to ask. Everyone else wanted to know if he would do it again, or if he had the money hidden somewhere, or how he had avoided getting caught. Nobody had ever asked if he regretted it. "Parts of it," he said slowly. "The robbing itself, no. Those companies took a lot more from a lot more people than I ever did from them. But," he stopped. "But what? There were people around me, men I ran with. Some of them got hurt. Some of them made choices they wouldn't have made if I hadn't been the one organizing it." His jaw tightened. "That part I carry." She turned to look at him, fully, directly, the way she seemed to do everything. "You led the gang." "Yes, and they scattered when it stopped being worth it, and you're here, and I'm here." She was silent for another moment, and he braced for the judgment that he had half expected this conversation to end in. "Instead," she said, "my father built this fence. He spent 3 weeks on it the summer I was 12, and I held posts for him the same way I did for you today. And he told me that the thing about doing honest work with your hands is that it leaves something real behind, something that was not there before you." She looked back at the fence line. "That always stayed with me." Bo did not say anything, but something in his chest shifted in a way that was almost painful. Over the following week, he came back to the property twice more on the pretense of completing other repairs, and Fiona did not pretend otherwise, and neither did he, and gradually the pretense fell away altogether. He came because he wanted to. She let him because she wanted him to. Neither of them said this explicitly, because they were both people who were much better at doing things than talking about them. But the feelings were building the way a fire builds, quietly, steadily, in the dark, until suddenly there is heat and light that was not there before. He told her more about his past in careful increments. Not all of it, not yet, but enough. The fact that he had grown up in Texas, the son of a horse trader who had died when Bo was 16, leaving him to find his own way in a territory where the options for a young man with no connections and no capital were limited. The way he had drifted into the company of men who operated outside the law, not from any great moral commitment to crime, but from a gradual erosion of alternatives. The fact that he had been good at it, which was its own kind of trap, because being good at something that other people needed made you more and more essential to it, until one day you looked up and were in charge of it, and the way out required burning everything you had built. She listened without softening the reality of it or making it better than it was. But she also did not make it worse. She told him in return about her own trajectory. Her father had been a surveyor, and she had learned his work alongside him, traveling through 3 territories with him as a child, carrying his equipment and learning to read a landscape the way other children learn to read books. When he settled in New Mexico and filed his homestead claim, she was the one who did the official survey, walking every boundary twice to make sure the documentation was unimpeachable. When he died, he left her the land in full faith that she was the most capable person he knew, and she took that faith as seriously as anything she had ever been given. "The thing about Voss," she said one evening, sitting on the porch of the cabin as the sun went down behind the canyon wall and turned the sky colors that had no proper names, "is not just that he wants the land. It's that he believes a woman alone is inherently a problem that should be solved for her. He keeps offering to find me a better situation in his letters, as though the problem is that I am without a husband rather than that he is trying to steal from me." "He's not wrong that you're alone," Bo said carefully. He was leaning against the porch post with his hat in his hands, watching the sky. "I'm not alone," she said. "I have the attorney in Santa Fe. I have Marshall Holt, limited as his authority is." "I have," she stopped, and then turned to look at him. "I have you for whatever that's worth." The words landed between them with a weight neither of them had quite planned for. Bo looked at her and did not look away. In the last light, with the canyon wind moving through the cottonwoods, she looked exhausted and resolute and extraordinarily beautiful. And he felt something that he recognized with a kind of dread as the specific feeling he had promised himself long ago he would not allow himself to feel, because men in his situation did not get to feel it without consequence. "It's worth something," he said very quietly. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she said, "Stay for dinner." He stayed. Over the dinner table in the small cabin kitchen, with the oil lamp throwing warm light across the space, they were easier with each other than they had been in daylight. She was funny, he discovered, dry and quick and self-aware, the kind of humor that lived in a precise observation rather than a performed moment. He found himself laughing at something she said and being briefly startled by the sound of it, because it had been a long time since he had laughed without it being performance. She noticed. "You don't do that often," she said. "What, laugh? Really laugh?" He looked at her. "No," he said. "I don't." She reached across the table and put her hand on his, just briefly, just for a moment, and then removed it, and the impression of warmth stayed on his skin longer than made any logical sense. He rode back to town that night with the specific feeling of a man who had stepped into something he could not step back out of, and was not entirely sure he wanted to. The following week, things accelerated. Voss filed 2 new documents in the territorial court: a claim of adverse possession based on a surveying irregularity, and a petition for injunction that, if granted, would prevent Fiona from making any improvements to the property, or selling it to any third party while the dispute was pending. The attorney in Santa Fe sent word that the judge assigned to the case was known to be favorable to the railroad interests, and that the injunction had a real possibility of being granted within 3 weeks. Fiona came to find Bo at the boarding house. She knocked on his door with the direct knock of a person who is past the point of managing appearances. He opened the door and took one look at her face and stepped back to let her in. She spread the attorney's letter on the small table and walked him through it. Her voice was steady, but her hands were not quite, and she did not seem to be aware of this, which meant the control she maintained was costing her more than she was letting show. "If the injunction passes," she said, "I can't make any repairs. I can't bring in income from the property while the dispute runs. I've already spent most of what I had on legal fees. If this runs another 6 months with an injunction in place, I won't have the money to sustain myself, and Voss knows that." "He wants you to run out of time," Bo said. "He always wanted me to run out of time. He just found a better mechanism." Bo looked at the letter. He had a mind that was good at structures, at seeing the shape of a situation, the pivot points, the places where pressure could be applied. It had made him a good outlaw. He was trying now to figure out if it could make him useful for something better. What does the attorney need to block the injunction? Evidence that Voss's survey discrepancy claim is fraudulent, which I believe it is. But getting that evidence means accessing the original survey records filed with the Territorial Land Office, and those are in Santa Fe. "Can your attorney get them?" He's trying. But Voss has someone in the land office who has been slow-walking document requests. It's like fighting smoke. She pressed her fingertips against the table. And the 3-week timeline is not enough for the postal back and forth. Bo was quiet for a moment. Something was crystallizing in him, not a plan exactly, but the beginning of one. It required things he had been trying to move away from. It required connections he had been trying to leave behind. But looking at Fiona, at the exhaustion and the iron determination in her face, he made the same decision he always made around her, which was the decision that put her before his own calculations. "I know someone in Santa Fe," he said. "A man who worked on the original railroad surveys in the territory before he was let go. He has copies of survey benchmarks that the land office doesn't. If Voss's survey is fabricated, this man would know." She looked at him sharply. "Who is this person?" "His name is Aldous." "He's not exactly," Bo paused. "He operates outside the edges of things, but he's honest about land because he cares about it. He was a surveyor before everything else went sideways. Can you trust him? With something like this, yes. Will he help if I ask him?" He met her eyes. "I'll need to go to Santa Fe." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "How long?" 4 days each way on a good horse, a day in the city. 9 days total if nothing goes wrong. That's cutting the 3-week window close. "I know." She was silent. He watched her calculating, weighing options against each other with the thoroughness of a woman who had learned not to count on anything she had not counted herself. "Bo," she said, and it was the first time she had said his name that way, not as identification but as address, as reach. "Why would you do this? You're a wanted man. Riding to Santa Fe risks everything for you." He looked at her. There were things he could have said. Practical things, deflective things. He chose the true thing instead. "Because I don't want Voss to win," he said. "And because I don't want to watch you lose something that belongs to you." He paused. "And because somewhere in the last 2 weeks you've become someone I would ride to Santa Fe for." The words sat between them in the small room. Fiona's expression did something complicated, a crack in the controlled surface briefly that let something bright and uncertain and almost afraid show through. Then she looked away and then back. "Come back," she said. "That's all I ask, come back." He left the next morning before dawn. The 9 days of his absence were some of the longest Fiona had spent. She kept herself occupied with ruthless discipline, continuing to document the property boundaries, writing detailed letters to her attorney, maintaining the cabin and the land with careful attention to anything that might serve as evidence of continuous occupation and improvement. She watched Dix from a distance and did not allow him to get close. She slept with her father's rifle propped against the wall beside her bed, but she thought about Bo with a frequency and depth that she found both illuminating and inconvenient. She was not a romantic in the conventional sense. She had not grown up dreaming of a man to complete her life, and she did not feel incomplete without one. But she had, without entirely meaning to, discovered in Bo Irons something she had not expected to find in anyone. A person whose company felt like a place where she could be exactly what she was without modification. He came back on the 8th day, 2 days before the 3-week deadline, riding a horse that had clearly been pushed hard and looking like a man who had not slept in 36 hours. He had the documents. Aldous had pulled his personal survey records, cross-referenced the benchmark data against Voss's filed discrepancy claim, and written a sworn affidavit that the survey irregularity Voss had identified was mathematically impossible based on the original datum points, which meant it had been manufactured. Fiona looked at the documents with the careful attention of someone who understood survey language, and when she looked up, her eyes were bright in a way that was not quite tears but was close to them. "This is it," she said. "This is what we needed." "Get it to your attorney today," Bo said. "Express rider to Santa Fe. It needs to be in front of the judge before the week is out." She was already reaching for her writing paper. Then she stopped, turned and looked at him, really looked at him, the way you look at someone when you are past the point of pretending you do not see them clearly. "Thank you," she said, and it was not the polite thank you of a transaction. It was the deep, careful thank you of a person who understands what something cost. He crossed the small cabin in 3 steps and kissed her. It was not a tentative kiss or a performed one. It was the kiss of 2 people who had been moving toward each other for weeks and had finally arrived, and it carried in it all the days of working beside each other and talking honestly and choosing each other quietly and continuously without saying so. She kissed him back. When they separated, she kept hold of the front of his coat with both hands, and he kept his hands on either side of her face, and they looked at each other at close range with the slightly stunned expression of people who have just discovered something they were not sure they were allowed to want. "Bo," she said. "I know," he said. She laughed briefly and a little unsteadily. "You can't know what I was going to say. You were going to say that this is complicated." She raised her eyebrows. "Was I wrong?" "No," he said. "It is. I'm not going to lie to you about that." She released his coat, smoothed it where she had gripped it. "Your situation." "My situation." She was quiet for a moment. "What happens when the Wells Fargo man with the long memory finds this town? I've been trying to figure out if there's a way to get ahead of that," he said. "To change the situation rather than keep running from it." "What does that mean?" He did not answer immediately, because the idea that had been forming in the back of his mind since the ride back from Santa Fe was not fully formed yet. He did not want to speak it before he was certain. But the direction of it, the sacrifice of it, was becoming increasingly clear. He touched her face briefly, with a tenderness that sat strangely on a man built the way he was built, but was entirely genuine. "It means I'm working on it," he said. The documents reached Santa Fe. The attorney presented them to the court 4 days before the injunction hearing. The judge, faced with a sworn surveyor's affidavit directly contradicting the basis of Voss's adverse possession claim, postponed the injunction hearing and ordered an independent survey of the disputed boundaries at the court's expense. It was not a victory, but it was a stay. It bought time. Voss was furious. He made no attempt to hide it. He sent Dix to Fiona's property on a morning when he must have calculated she would be alone. and Dix did something he had not done before. He went onto the property, uninvited, and made it clear with his presence and his language that the Consolidated Western Land Company was not accustomed to losing, and that she should consider very carefully whether the independence of her position was worth what was coming. Fiona met him on the porch with her father's rifle in her hands and told him, in the same level voice she used for everything, that he was trespassing, and she would give him 30 seconds to start walking before she sent a shot over his head as a warning, and the second one would not be a warning. Dix left. She reported it to Marshal Holt, who took a statement and told her, apologetically, that a man walking onto property and talking to her was not, strictly speaking, a crime that he had the authority to act on without witnesses. But he looked troubled by it in a way that suggested his own patience with Voss was thinning. Bo heard about it at the boarding house from Hadley's boy, who had been in the road and seen Dix approaching the property. He was at the cabin in 20 minutes. Fiona was fine. She was sitting at her table drinking coffee with the precise control of a person who has chosen coffee as the thing to do with their hands when the alternative is to shake. She looked up when he came through the door, and for one moment, just one, the control cracked entirely, and what was underneath? It was raw and frightened and exhausted and human. He crossed to her and put his arms around her without asking permission or preamble, and she pressed her face against his chest and held on. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Then she said, against his shirt, "I'm so tired of being brave all the time." "I know," he said, his voice low against her hair. "You don't have to be right now." She breathed. He held on. The cabin was quiet around them, the creak sound coming through the window, and something between them that had been building and building finally settled into the simplest and most complete thing. They were in this together, and they both knew it, and it was no longer a question. After a while she pulled back, wiped her eyes with the back of her hand in a matter-of-fact motion, and said, "Tell me about the idea you've been working on." He sat down across the table from her. He had been thinking about it for 9 days. He had turned it every direction, looked at it from every angle, weighed the costs and the alternatives, and arrived at the same conclusion each time with the inevitability of mathematics. "Voss is going to keep coming," he said. "The stay on the injunction buys months, not permanence. Even if the independent survey confirms your title, and it will because Aldis's data is solid, Voss will find another avenue. He has money and time and motivation. He will grind away at you until you can't sustain it anymore." "I know," she said quietly. "The only thing that stops him is if someone with actual authority takes an active interest in what he's doing. Not a territorial court that he has connections in. Something more direct." He paused. "Marshal Holt is limited by his jurisdiction and the legal standard for what constitutes a crime. But if I went to him, if I gave him enough, turned myself in, gave him Voss's fraudulent documents as something I had knowledge of in a way that would hold up, Holt could open a federal inquiry. Fraud against a territorial court is a federal matter. That gets a U.S. Marshal involved. That ends Voss." She stared at him. The color had drained from her face. "Turn yourself in," she said slowly. "Yes, Bo, you're wanted in 4 territories. The charges against you are real," he said. "I know what they are. I've been living with them for 8 years. His voice was steady. He had made this decision. "If I turn myself in and cooperate, there's a possibility, not a certainty, but a possibility, of a reduced sentence. The railway company I robbed twice has a standing policy of reduced cooperation for information, leading to recovery of assets. I know where some of the money ended up. Not all of it, but enough. And if I give testimony against Dix for the wrist breaking in the alley last spring, That man spoke to the deputy about it and never filed a report. It builds a picture of Voss's operation that a federal inquiry can use. She was on her feet. She was not a woman who paced, but she was standing now, turned away from him, one hand pressed flat against the wall beside the window. "You would be going to prison," she said, "possibly. For a time." She turned back to him. Her eyes were bright, and this time it was not the brightness of relief. "And you think this is worth it, to secure my land title?" "I think," he said carefully, "that it is worth it to make sure you are safe, that Voss cannot take this place from you, that Dix cannot walk onto your property again and threaten you while Holt's hands are tied." His voice did not waver. "And I think that if I spend the rest of my life running, I will never have anything worth running from." She came back to the table, sat across from him, put her hands on the table between them, not quite touching his but close. "Bo," she said, and her voice was different now, stripped of all the careful control, speaking from somewhere deep and undefended. "I cannot let you do this for me. It's not only for you," he said. "It's because I'm tired of my own ledger too. Because Aldous is a man with a past who is honest about land, and somewhere on that ride to Santa Fe, I understood something about what it means to use what you are for something that matters." He looked at her with the steadiness of a man who has passed through his own decision and come out the other side. "And because I love you, Fiona. I am telling you that plainly, without theater or strategy. I love you, and I am not willing to let Voss have this place that you and your father built, and this is the only play I have left that is actually worth anything." The words fell between them like stones into still water. She was very still. "You love me," she said. "Yes." "You've known me 3 weeks. I know." He did not look away. "Is it untrue?" She held his gaze for a long, complete moment. Then, "No," she said very quietly. "It is not untrue." She paused. "I love you too. And I need you to know that before you walk into that jailhouse, because I am not going to let you do this thinking it's only a transaction." He reached across the table and took her hands. "It is not only a transaction," he said. They sat like that for a moment, holding on with everything the next step would cost them lying visible between them, and they did not flinch from it. "Will you at least negotiate?" she said. "Before you give Holt everything, will you find out what they'll actually offer?" "Yes," he said. "I'm not going to hand myself over without understanding the terms, but I am going to go." She tightened her grip on his hands for one moment, then let go. The next morning he walked into the Redemption Creek jailhouse and laid his shackles on the desk. Marshal Holt circled him like a man examining a thing he could not quite believe was real. Then he sat down and said, "Start talking." Bo talked for 3 hours. He laid out the railway robberies with the precision of a man who had organized them and remembered every detail. He gave the locations of 2 asset deposits that Wells Fargo had been searching for. He described the dissolution of the Irons gang, gave the names and last known locations of 3 members, and made clear that none of them had been in his company for over a year. Then he turned to Voss. He explained what he knew: the fraudulent survey claim, the manufactured creditor's lien, the intimidation campaign conducted through Dix, and explained where Aldis's affidavit came from and why it was valid. He explained about Dix breaking the man's wrist and the unreported deputy conversation. He laid out the structure of Voss's land acquisition campaign with the clarity of a man who had been studying it for 3 weeks, because he had been studying it for 3 weeks. Holt listened to all of it without interrupting. When Bo was finished, the marshal sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a long moment. "You know I have to lock you up while I telegraph the U.S. Marshal's office," Holt said. "I know. This could take days, weeks possibly. I know." Holt stood and took his key ring off the wall. He opened the cell in the back room, a small iron bar room with a cot and a window that looked out onto the alley. Then he stopped. "The woman," he said. "Keller." Bo looked at him. "She know you're doing this?" "Yes." Holt was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She's a good woman. Handled herself with more decency than most men would have in her situation." He gestured toward the cell. "I'll write to the U.S. Marshal personally. Give your cooperation a strong recommendation. I won't pretend I know how it'll come out, but I'll do what I can." Bo stepped into the cell. The door closed. He sat on the cot and listened to the lock turn, and looked at the wall of the jailhouse and felt, beneath the weight of what he had just done, a specific and strange peace that he had not known he was capable of. He had done something real. Something that left something behind that was not a whole. The weeks that followed were the hardest of Fiona's life, and also, in a strange way, some of the most clarifying. She visited the jailhouse every day that Holt would allow, which was most days. She brought food when she could, sat across the iron bars from Bo and talked, really talked, the kind of talking that people do when circumstances strip away the social scaffolding, and what is left is just two people being honest with each other. They talked about everything. About the land and what she planned to do with it. About his years in Texas and the horse-trading father and what it had been like to be 16 and suddenly alone. About her father and the surveys they had ridden together, and the way he used to describe a piece of land as if it were a person with a particular character. About what they both wanted for lives that neither of them had had the freedom to plan before. The independent survey came back. It confirmed Fiona's title. The disputed boundary was exactly where her original documents placed it, and the benchmark data from Aldis's records was consistent with every official record in existence, which meant Voss's claim was not a survey discrepancy, but a fabrication, which the court surveyor said as much in his report. 2 weeks after Bo's surrender, a U.S. Marshal named Calvert arrived in Redemption Creek from the federal district office in Albuquerque. He interviewed Bo for 2 days. He interviewed Marshal Holt. He sent a deputy to investigate Dix, who turned out to have an outstanding warrant in Texas that made the conversation significantly more productive. He issued a federal subpoena to the Consolidated Western Land Company's offices in St. Louis for documentation of all title acquisition activities in the New Mexico territory. Voss left town on a Wednesday night with apparent urgency and without farewell. He left behind a half-finished office, a set of filing cabinets full of documents that the federal marshal's deputy went through with great interest, and a land agent named Forbes, who had not been informed of Voss's departure, and found himself suddenly and involuntarily very cooperative. The fraudulent lien against Fiona's property was withdrawn from the territorial court within the month. The adverse possession claim collapsed without Voss to press it. The injunction petition was dismissed. Fiona Keller's title to her property was confirmed and recorded without encumbrance in the New Mexico Territorial Land Office on a Tuesday in November, with a notation that all prior claims and disputes had been resolved in her favor by order of the territorial court. She received the official document at the cabin and stood in the doorway with it and cried for about 10 minutes, alone, with the creek sound filling the canyon. And then she washed her face and went to tell Bo. The federal negotiation took longer. Marshal Calvert was, it turned out, a man of genuine fairness in an era when that was not guaranteed. He assessed Bo's cooperation, reviewed the list of assets recovered through his testimony, and wrote a recommendation to the circuit court judge that cited substantial cooperation, no violence in the surrendered period, and a pattern of robbery that had targeted corporate interests rather than individuals. Wells Fargo's representative, who came to Redemption Creek for a deposition, was less generous in his assessment but acknowledged, when pressed by Calvert, that the recovered assets represented the majority of the documented losses from both railway robberies. The circuit court judge reviewed the complete file in early December and issued a sentence of 2 years confinement at the territorial prison in Santa Fe, with credit for the 6 weeks already served in Redemption Creek, and a formal notation of substantial cooperation with federal investigations. The charges from the Arizona Territory and the 2 other territories were consolidated into the single sentence. When the 2 years were served, Bo Irons would have no remaining outstanding warrants. Fiona sat across the jail bars when Bo read her the judge's letter, and she took the paper from him and read it herself, and when she looked up, her eyes were very bright. 2 years, she said, less the 6 weeks. That's still almost 2 years. I know. She held his gaze through the iron bars with something in her expression that was layered, relief and grief and love, and the particular kind of endurance that she had been exercising her whole life. I will wait, she said, without any flourish or ceremony, because she was not a person who needed flourish to mean something completely. I will be there when you walk out. He put his hand through the bars and she took it. Fiona, he said. Don't tell me you're not worth waiting for, she said calmly. I have already evaluated that question and arrived at a conclusion. He laughed, that real laugh that startled him every time. What was the conclusion? That you are. She squeezed his hand once, firm and sure. So do your time and come home. He was transferred to the territorial prison in Santa Fe in December of 1882 on a cold, clear morning. Fiona drove the wagon to the edge of town and stood beside it while the deputy and the prisoner passed, and Bo looked at her from the seat of the transport wagon, and they held each other's gaze for as long as was possible before the distance closed it. She went home to the cabin and began the work of building toward a future. The 22 months that followed were not passive. Fiona threw herself into the property with a focus that had been previously divided between the legal battle and everything else, and now had room to breathe. She repaired the cabin roof, which had needed it for years. She expanded the kitchen garden with a determined pragmatism. She negotiated a small income from allowing a neighboring rancher to graze cattle on the lower pasture in exchange for fence maintenance. She continued her survey work, taking contracts from the Territorial Land Office as an independent surveyor. Work she could do without a male counterpart now that the office in Santa Fe had begun, cautiously, to accept her credentials. She wrote to Bo every week without exception. The letters were not sentimental in the way that letters in that genre sometimes are. They were detailed and honest and full of the specific texture of daily life. What the weather had been, what she had repaired, what the surveying work had involved, what she had read in the Albuquerque newspaper, what was growing. They were the letters of a woman who believed that love was not maintained by emotion alone, but by the ongoing act of sharing a life, even across a distance. Bo wrote back. His letters were shorter because he had less to report, but they were careful and specific and entirely his voice, which she had come to know well enough to hear in her mind as she read. He described the prison work, mostly carpentry, which suited him. He described the conversations he had with other men there, the ones that had made him think, the ones that had made him understand his own past differently. He described, once, in a letter that she read 3 times, the moment he had understood that he had spent 8 years building something that was fundamentally unmoorings, and that it had taken her to make him want to be rooted. She kept every letter in a cedar box under her bed, which she recognized as the behavior of a woman in love and declined to be self-conscious about. Aldous came to visit the property in the spring. He had heard from Calvert that things had been resolved and wanted to see the land the survey had been about. He was a small, precise man in his 60s with an extraordinary eye and a habit of talking about benchmark elevations in the way other men talked about horses. He and Fiona got along immediately and completely. He stayed for a week, helped her with a survey of the northern pasture, and left with a standing offer to serve as a reference for any territorial surveying work she applied for. Marshal Holt came out to the property on an afternoon in the summer with no official pretext, and had coffee with her on the porch and told her, in an oblique and gruff way that was clearly the closest he came to sentiment, that he thought Beau Irons was a man who was worth the waiting for. She said she agreed, which made Holt go red and change the subject to the creek levels. She smiled about it for the rest of the afternoon. In the 3rd month of the 2nd year, she started building. There was a room off the back of the cabin that her father had used for storage, larger than was really necessary for storage, that she had always thought could be something else. She did the work mostly herself, with some help from a carpenter in town named Ruiz, who respected her ability to know exactly what she wanted, and did not waste time explaining things she already knew. They opened the wall between the storage room and the main cabin, laid a proper floor, put in a second window. It became a real room, spacious and light-filled, with a view of the creek through the new window, and the canyon wall turning red in the afternoon sun. She did not write to Beau about the room. She wanted it to be something he discovered. He was released from the Santa Fe Territorial Prison on a clear October morning in 1884. Fiona had ridden down to Santa Fe to be there. She had not told him she was coming. She had calculated the date of release with the care of a surveyor and arrived the evening before, staying in a hotel near the plaza. She stood outside the prison gate in the early morning light with her hat casting a shadow across her face and her heart doing something considerably less controlled than her expression. The gate opened. Beau walked out. He was thinner than she remembered, by a little, and his hair was shorter, and there was a new line or two at the corners of his eyes that had not been there before. He was wearing the clothes he had been transferred in and carrying a small bundle of belongings, and he looked exactly like himself, which was the word she had been reaching for through the entire 22 months, herself. He was the thing she had been reaching toward in all that time. He saw her. He stopped. He stood very still for a moment in the October morning with the prison gate behind him and the free air around him and Fiona Keller in front of him, and something moved through his face that was too complicated for any single name. She walked toward him. He crossed the remaining distance faster. They met in the middle of the dusty courtyard in front of the prison gate, and he pulled her to him with the force of a man who had spent 22 months being careful about everything, and was done being careful about this. And she held on with both arms and her face against his neck, and neither of them said anything for a long time, because there was nothing that needed saying that was not already being said. Eventually, he pulled back far enough to look at her. He was looking at her the way you look at something you were afraid you would forget and did not. "You came," he said. "I said I would." His hand curved against the side of her face. His eyes were very dark and very warm, and the love in them was not new, but it was arriving all at once the way things arrive after long absence. "Fiona," he said. "Yes," she said, which was not an answer to the question he hadn't asked yet, but was an answer to the one underneath it. He kissed her in the courtyard outside the Santa Fe Territorial Prison, with the sun coming up over the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. And this time, the kiss had 22 months of letters and longing and endurance in it. and it was the kind of kiss that marks a before and an after. They rode back to Redemption Creek together over 2 days, stopping at a way station inn for the night, talking for hours the way they had talked across the jail bars, but now with the extraordinary freedom of being in the same physical space, able to reach across and touch without iron between them. He told her about the prison, the carpentry work, the men he had met, the ones who had made him think. He told her about the particular Monday morning about 8 months in when he had woken up and felt, instead of the restlessness that had been his constant companion for years, something quieter. Something like the beginning of peace. He told her about the letter he had written that he never sent because it was too much to put in a letter. The one where he had tried to explain that she had done something to him that he did not have vocabulary for, which was to make him want to be the kind of man who was worth coming home to. She listened to all of it with her whole attention, the way she always listened. When he was done, she told him about the room she had built. He was quiet for a moment. "A room," he said, "off the back of the cabin. It has a view of the creek. Why didn't you write about it?" She looked at him sideways. "Because I wanted you to see it." He looked at her. The quietness of what that meant moved through him slowly. "You built a room for me." "I built a room for us," she said. "There's a distinction." He took her hand on the saddle between their horses and held it, and the distinction she had made settled into him like the thing it was, not just a room, but a choice about a future. A declaration made in wood and glass and labor. They arrived in Redemption Creek on a late afternoon in October, riding down the main street with the low sun turning everything gold. Several people came to their doorways or stopped in the street. Hadley came out of the general store with his hat in his hands and the expression of a man managing considerable embarrassment, and nodded at both of them. Marshal Holt was on the jailhouse porch, and when he saw them, he stood up straight and gave one deliberate nod that communicated more than he probably intended. They rode out to the property as the sun went down. Beau unsaddled the horses at the small corral her father had built, and Fiona stood back and watched him do it with the particular feeling of watching a person be entirely at home in a place for the first time, not performing comfort but actually inhabiting it. He came back to where she was standing, and they walked to the cabin together. She took him through to the new room. He stood in it for a long moment. The creek sound came through the new window, and the last light of day was making a long, warm rectangle across the floor, and the room was simple and real and entirely what she had intended it to be, a place built for staying. He turned and looked at her in the doorway. "Marry me," he said. She did not flinch or pause or make him wait for effect. "Yes," she said, in the same clear, direct tone she used for everything that mattered. He crossed to her in 3 steps and kissed her again. And this time, it was the kiss that was the beginning of something rather than the culmination of something, which was its own kind of extraordinary. They were married in Redemption Creek on a Thursday in November of 1884. Marshal Holt served as witness, which he did with a face so carefully composed against any visible emotion that everyone present could see exactly how much he was feeling. Aldous rode up from Santa Fe for the occasion and brought a bottle of genuine Kentucky bourbon, which he announced was a medicinal purchase and should be treated as such. The ceremony was performed by the town's circuit preacher, a pragmatic man named Deacon Ames who had seen enough frontier life to have stripped away any unnecessary ceremony and kept what mattered. He asked them the meaningful questions. They answered with the assurance of 2 people who had already lived through their answers before they were asked. Fiona wore a dress she had made herself from blue wool and white cotton, which was practical for a November in the canyon, and also the most beautiful thing Beau had ever seen anyone wear. He wore his cleanest shirt, and a coat that Ruiz the carpenter had insisted on lending him, which fit nearly well enough. He stood beside her in front of the small crowd, because half the town had turned up, whether invited or not, with the expression of a man arriving somewhere he had not known he was heading when he started. When it was done, Holt shook Beau's hand and said, "You turned out all right, Irons." Beau said, "I had help. The first winter they were married was cold and close, and the best winter either of them could remember. They learned the rhythms of sharing a life with the same practical attentiveness they brought to everything. Who slept which side of the bed, who made coffee in the morning, who was more useful with a hammer, and who was more useful with a ledger, whose instincts about weather were more reliable. They disagreed productively and with interest. They discovered in each other, in the close quarters of winter, a depth and a specificity of character that the courtship had promised, and the marriage delivered. Beau took work with Ruiz's carpentry operation. He was good at it, better than good. It turned out, in the particular way that some people find in middle life a thing they were always suited for, but never given reason to pursue. He had a structural sense, an understanding of how things were meant to bear weight, and a patience for detail that surprised people who had only ever seen the outlaw version of him. By spring, he was doing contract work for a small construction outfit in Albuquerque, riding out for the larger jobs, and returning with money that went into a lockbox under the floorboard by the fireplace. Fiona's surveying work continued to grow. The Territorial Land Office in Santa Fe had, by 1885, become accustomed to receiving survey reports from F. Keller and had, after some internal debate that she was aware of and declined to give energy to, begun assigning her to independent contracts the way they assigned male surveyors, on the basis of the quality of her work. She rode out with her instruments twice a month, came back with precise documents, and filed them with the office in Santa Fe by express rider. In the spring of 1885, she found out she was pregnant. She told Beau on an evening when they were sitting on the porch after supper, the canyon going dark around them and the creek sounding its constant steady note. She said it directly, with her hands around her coffee cup and her eyes on the middle distance, in the tone of a person delivering a significant fact. He was quiet for a moment. Then he turned to look at her, and the expression on his face was something she kept in her memory afterward like a painting, complicated and bright and entirely unguarded. "Is that—" he started and then stopped. "Good," she supplied. "Yes, for me, for both of us if you want it to be." He reached over and took her hand. His grip was firm and warm and certain. "It is," he said. "It very much is." They sat with it for a while in the evening quiet, the fact of it settling between them like the best kind of weight. Their son was born in November of 1885, which Fiona appreciated as evidence of good timing, a November child, like the marriage, which felt right for reasons she could not fully articulate. They named him James, for her father, and the name felt true in the cabin that James Keller had built, with the creek her father had loved running outside and the land that had cost so much and been worth every bit of it. James was a substantial, opinionated infant who made clear from his first hours that he intended to be specific about his needs and preferences. Beau held him in the first hour with the expression of a man confronting something that had dismantled every prior certainty, and within 3 days had the particular competence of a person who brings full attention to whatever he is doing, and the baby seemed to understand this and respond to it. Fiona watched her husband with their son and felt a warmth so complete it was almost structural, like the warmth of a well-built room. Not dramatic but load-bearing, the kind that keeps everything else standing. Aldous came for the birth, which had not been planned but turned out to be exactly right, because he arrived 2 days afterward and spent a week being practically useful in ways that freed Fiona to focus on James without guilt. He and Beau built a proper cradle out of cedar wood in the evenings after supper, and the two men discovered, in the way of people who like doing things together, a friendship that had been building since the affidavit and simply needed space. In 1886, Beau took on a partner in the carpentry work, a man named Samuel Torres, who had come up from Chihuahua with a family to feed and more skill with a wood plane than anyone Beau had encountered. They formalized a small construction business, registered with the Territorial Trade Office under the name Irons and Torres, and by 1887 were taking contracts as far north as Albuquerque and as far east as Las Vegas. It was not wealth, but it was solid and growing and real, and it was work Beau came home from satisfied rather than exhausted. The land remained. Fiona kept the property documented with a surveyor's precision, the boundary markers maintained, the title recorded at every opportunity in the territorial records. She was not going to let paperwork be the vulnerability again. The Consolidated Western Land Company had largely retreated from the New Mexico Territory, following the federal inquiry that Beau's testimony had triggered. 2 of Voss's fraudulent acquisition cases had been prosecuted, resulting in judgments that cost the company significantly. And the anticipated railroad spur had been rerouted so far north that Fiona's Canyon land was no longer commercially relevant to them anyway. She occasionally thought about Voss, wherever he had gone, and felt nothing much. The battle had been real, and it had cost real things, but it was over, and what was on the other side of it was worth what it had cost, and she was not inclined to spend time in the past when the present was this specific and good. James walked at 11 months, which he did with the assurance of a small person who has decided that this is the next thing to do and is simply getting on with it. He talked at 14 months in short declarative statements about what he wanted and observed, which Fiona said was inherited, and Beau said was impossible to know the origin of, but was not disputable as a characteristic. In the summer of 1888, when James was 2.5 and had claimed the eastern portion of the kitchen garden as his personal domain, Fiona discovered she was pregnant again. This time she told Beau at breakfast, handing him his coffee and then saying, "There will be another one in the spring." He looked up from his coffee with that same expression, the one she kept, and then he was on his feet with his arms around her and his face in her hair. And he said something quietly against her hair that was just her name, said in a specific way, with everything that her name contained when he said it, which was more than she had ever expected a name to carry. Their daughter arrived in March of 1889, which surprised exactly nobody when she turned out to be an extremely decisive newborn with strong opinions and her mother's auburn hair. They named her Clara, and James regarded her with the deep seriousness of a 3-year-old confronting a reality that had rearranged his previous understanding of the world, and within 2 weeks had appointed himself her chief guardian in a manner that nobody had requested, but everyone appreciated. Life in Redemption Creek continued around them with the texture of a place slowly becoming something. Not the dust-choked frontier settlement of 1882, but something more settled, more various, more permanent. The railroad had come through to the north, as Voss had always anticipated, and brought commerce and people and some tension along with it. But it had also brought mail service twice a week, and a newspaper that arrived from Albuquerque with only 2 days' delay. The town had a proper school by 1888, which Fiona had been vocal in supporting. She had donated the surveying work for the school site free of charge, and had written 2 letters to the Territorial Education Board that were cited in the board's eventual decision to allocate funds. She was not on the school board, because the school board was composed of men who had not yet arrived at the position that women should be on school boards. But she was thoroughly aware of its deliberations through several back channels and found ways to be useful anyway. Marshall Holt retired in 1889 and was replaced by a younger man named Archie Prout, who was competent and fair, and not as satisfying to disagree with as Holt had been. Holt moved into a smaller house at the edge of town and grew tomatoes with surprising dedication, and visited the Irons cabin for supper once a month with the reliability of a man who has found something good and is not going to let it slip. Beau at 36 was substantially different from Beau at 28 and substantially the same as Beau at 31, which is the mathematics of a man who has found his particular ground. He was calmer without being soft. He was still large and dark and marked by his history, but the edge that had lived in him during the years of running had been replaced by something else. Not ease exactly, which was not in his nature, but a deep steadiness, the kind that comes from knowing where you are. He was not a man who talked about his feelings frequently, and this had not changed, but he was a man who showed them consistently, which Fiona had come to understand was worth considerably more. He brought her coffee before she asked for it. He read to James in the evenings with a patience and expressiveness that consistently surprised her. He held Clara in the crook of one arm while working at the table with the other hand as naturally as breathing. He told Fiona he loved her in the specific moments, not the ceremonial ones, but the Tuesday afternoon ones, the ones in the kitchen, the ones when she came back from a survey ride, and he looked at her coming through the gate, because those were the moments that were real. She told him she loved him in similar moments, and with similar specificity, and they had both come to understand that this was the texture of a love that had been chosen rather than fallen into. It required the ongoing act of choosing, and they chose, and that made it something neither of them had expected to have in this particular form. In the spring of 1891, when Clara was 2 and James was 5, and just beginning to read with a ferocious enthusiasm, Beau and Samuel Torres completed their largest contract, a town hall building in Albuquerque that had been a 2-year project and was, by any standard, excellent work. The Albuquerque Weekly Citizen wrote a short item about it that mentioned Irons and Torres by name as the contractors, and Fiona cut it out and put it in the cedar box with the letters. He saw her put it in the box and said, "That's embarrassing." "It is evidence," she said, "of the ongoing pattern." "What pattern?" She looked at him over her shoulder. "Of you being worth paying attention to." He made a sound that was not quite dismissive but was in the general vicinity of trying to be, which meant she had landed it correctly. That evening after supper, when James was asleep and Clara was fighting sleep with the determined rearguard action of a 2-year-old, Beau sat on the porch in the dark with Fiona beside him and the canyon all around them, and the creek running its constant note and the stars over the New Mexico territory doing what they had always done, which was to be extraordinary and indifferent and beautiful all at once. He said, "I want to tell you something." She waited. "I think about what I was," he said slowly, "before this. Before you, before the land, before James and Clara. I think about riding into this town with nothing and wanting nothing, which is what I told myself. And I think about how that was not entirely true." He paused. "I wanted something, I just didn't know what the shape of it was." She turned to look at him. "And now," she said, "now I know it was this, exactly this." He gestured, which for Beau was a significant expressive act, a gesture that took in the cabin and the land and the children asleep inside and her face in the starlight. "I traded my freedom for your safety, and I would do it again in the same moment. But what I didn't know when I walked into that jailhouse was that the other side of it was going to be more free than I had ever been. She reached over and took his hand. "That is," she said very quietly, "the most you have ever said at one time." "I know," he said. "Don't get used to it." She laughed, that laugh that he had always felt as specifically his, the warm and real one, and leaned against his shoulder, and he turned his face into her hair, and the canyon night was cool and full of stars and entirely sufficient. They sat there for a long time, not talking, not needing to. The creek ran. The stars moved their slow arc across the dark. Inside, James and Clara slept in the cabin that James Keller had built, in the land that his daughter had defended and his daughter's husband had secured with the only currency he had left to offer, and which had turned out to be enough. It had turned out to be more than enough. It had turned out to be everything. His name had been in 4 wanted notices across 4 territories, and now it was on a carpentry business and a land record, and a marriage certificate, and on the lips of 2 small children who ran to the door when they heard his horse in the yard. It was a better record. He thought so every morning when he woke up in the canyon light beside Fiona, with the creak sound in the window and the smell of coffee already coming from the kitchen. And he thought so every evening when the light went low and gold over the canyon wall, and the day was done, and what he had built was around him in every direction. He had traded his freedom and received something larger in its place. He had received a life that was worth the living. And out on the eastern ridge of Redemption Creek, New Mexico Territory, with the cottonwoods growing tall along the water and the survey markers standing firm in the red earth, the Irons family was home and would remain so, and that was the whole of the story and the best of it.